Categorically, drought is an unwelcome visitor in any agricultural area. But in the southwestern plains in the late 1800s and the first quarter of the 20th century, dry spells came more frequently and stayed longer. In 1890 and again in 1910, drought struck the region with devastating results. Crops withered away, and a number of farms and ranches were temporarily abandoned. These events paled in comparison to what happened as a result of the drought that lasted from 1926 to 1932. Annual rainfall was barely sufficient to settle even minor dust devils, let alone raging dust storms. Let's talk about deaths in the dust. Unbeknownst to farmers and ranchers, they had inadvertently prepared the soil for the formation of dust clouds and dust storms that produced muddy rain as far east as Washington, D.C. Oklahoma prairie soil settled on the decks of cargo ships 200 miles out in the Atlantic. Dust particles from the Great Plains made their way into clean luxury apartments and offices in New York City. Meanwhile, back on the plains, blackened clouds or black blizzards formed during windstorms. Those storms greatly reduced visibility while creating hazardous health conditions. In March 1935, microscopic particles kicked up in a Colorado storm caused 48 relief workers to contract dust pneumonia. 4 of the workers sadly died from the illness, and in another dust storm in New Mexico, 5 children and 1 family smothered to death in their beds. On May 11, 1934, one storm displaced 300 million tons of fertile soil, which interestingly enough is the equivalent of the earth scooped away to dig the Panama Canal. These black blizzards were not caused by nature alone. In the open prairie of the southwestern plains, grama, big bluestem, and little bluestem, as well as buffalo grass, have always provided natural protection against erosion. Their intricate root systems house nitrogen-fixing bacteria along with chelating or binding agents, which are also present in legumes. Natural conditions had always encouraged healthy soil structure and plant growth. While plows broke up root systems on farms, heavy cattle grazing packed down rangelands, effectively reducing soil structure and arability. Overgrazing too is a contributing factor in decimating grass clumps. With no root systems in place to keep the soil from blowing away, the stage was set for the Dust Bowl. As Will Rogers described the activities that led to the Dust Bowl, and I quote, "Any old great civilization they've ever gone down and dug up, they go down and find 2 or 3 layers all buried there in the dust. And they've all been covered up because of plowed up ground that shouldn't have ever been plowed up in the first place. And trees cut down that shouldn't have ever been cut down anyway." Now remember a couple years back when Roosevelt suggested planting millions of trees across the dry regions? He said, "Every so many miles we'll plant a row of trees clear across the country." Imagine the government going into the tree planting business. What a nut idea. Well, it was so nutty that it would be about 10 to 15 years before they'd be compelled to do it. That's how nutty it was. End of quote. Let's talk about conservation efforts. Along with aviator Wiley Post, a fellow Oklahoman, Will Rogers was killed in a plane crash near Point Barrow, Alaska on August 15, 1935. He did not get to witness the implementation of the shelter belt policy. In that same year, the federal government launched its massive tree planting campaign. In total, the government planted more than 218 million trees on 30,000 farms, forming 20,000 miles of windbreaks. Today, shelter belts, windbreaks, reduce soil erosion and wind desiccation on plants. Shelter belts are planted on the western sides of farms or ranches in a north-south direction. Because trees must be able to survive on less than 30 inches of precipitation a year, the variety of trees grown in a shelter belt is limited. Red cedar, spruce, and pine are frequently grown along with rows of grain in between them for extra erosion control. Shelter belts are made up of anywhere from 1 to 5 rows of trees and grains. Studies show that a 30-mile-per-hour wind, which is not unusual, striking a 5-row shelter belt is reduced to 8 miles per hour on the immediate leeward side. At 300 feet on the leeward side, the velocity is still only 14 miles per hour. Sun protection against strong winds is measured at 1,500 feet east of a shelter belt. Unfortunately, before the Roosevelt administration's efforts to stabilize farm conditions in the 1930s, shelter belts were virtually unheard of among farm and ranch populations of the western Great Plains. In addition to the shelter belt policy, Roosevelt established the Soil Erosion Service, SES, in 1934. The completion of the projects impressed Congress so much that it created the Soil Conservation Service, SCS. The Rural Electrification Administration, REA, was established in 1935. By 1950, 78% of farms and ranches in the United States were able to replace windmills with electricity. This innovation enabled farmers and ranchers to draft larger volumes of water from the Ogallala, the ancient sandstone aquifer that lies under the western high plains. The Ogallala is made up of materials eroded from the Rocky Mountains. The porous subterranean rock formation stretches from the Texas Panhandle and eastern Colorado to western Oklahoma and western Kansas. It then spreads eastward and underlies roughly 4/5 of Nebraska. It reaches a maximum thickness of 900 feet in southwestern Ochiltree County, Texas. In total, the Ogallala lies beneath 225,000 square miles of high plains. Besides providing water for irrigation for farms and ranches, it also furnishes drinking water for over 2 million people. As a consequence of depleting groundwater faster than nature can recharge it, the cost of pumping increasingly deeper water to the surface and then to storage containers is adding to regional economic woes. At some point in the near future, the aquifer will be completely depleted. Exacerbating the situation, according to Daniel Wilhite, is global warming. He contends that the region under the influence of global warming will become drier, and as a result, soil moisture as well as atmospheric conditions will become more arid. He sees the drying of soil and the depletion of the Ogallala as a consequence of global warming, when in fact it may actually contribute to it. While a great deal of attention is given to the role of carbon dioxide in climate change, humidity is an equally culpable heat-trapping or greenhouse gas. The addition of 650 trillion gallons of ancient Ogallala groundwater into the hydrologic cycle is increasing humidity and could be contributing to warmer temperatures. Most of the water mined from the Ogallala or drafted from the Ogallala has been in subterranean liquid states for eons of time. In summary, unless there is an increase in the amount of rainfall in the western plains, the supply of groundwater will run out in the not-so-distant future. With millions of non-farm residents depending on that water supply, how will western states and counties respond? Farmers and ranchers spend more and more money to reach the declining levels of water in the Ogallala. While shelter belts, rotating crops, and no-till agricultural methods have helped reduce the occurrence of dust storms, water for irrigation and domestic consumption remains a major challenge. Well, thanks for joining me on this exploration of the environment. I hope we helped you appreciate some very real and overlooked environmental issues. I'll see you next time on The Vantage Point.